Before we get started, I'd like to take a quick poll of the audience to find out what industry you all reside in, because depending on your particular area of expertise, you might come at this with a different perspective. So if you could quickly answer the poll questions about what industry you come from, we can then assess the results, and that would provide me some guidance in how to tailor the talk. We'll give a few minutes. Oh, thank you. Already coming in, it looks like we have about roughly 80% of you come from the pharma industry, with 22% from the government. So that helps me in that my work at the Hamner Institute focuses primarily on chemical safety issues related towards toxicity testing. But in using some of the in vitro to in vivo extrapolation tools, obviously we've relied quite heavily on a lot of these tools that were developed for use in the pharmaceutical industry. So you'll catch nuances of that as I go through the presentation. My work over the past 6-7 years at the Hamner Institute has been working quite closely with the U.S. EPA, primarily with the ToxCast program. Within the EPA, they've been burdened with a chemical risk management challenge of enormity in that the burden of proof is on them to determine whether or not a particular chemical poses a human health hazard. And with tens of thousands of chemicals currently in use in commerce, it hasn't been realistic to even consider that the traditional animal in vivo tests that have traditionally been used is going to be appropriate to inform these toxicity testing challenges. So since 2007, the ToxCast program was developed or originated to deal with this issue. And since then, they've been employing a suite of different high-throughput screening assays and assay technologies to help them to better understand some of the in vitro bioactivities of chemicals. Through utilizing high-throughput screening tools, they can more efficiently screen across thousands of chemicals. And they've done just that over the past 7 or 8 years. In that time, they've accumulated data on close to 2,000 chemicals across over 700 different assay endpoints. But as we all recognize, activities at the in vitro level, as measured in these plates, you lose the context of what they mean in terms of an actual external exposure to the chemical. How do you link what activities you see out to a real-world exposure? And through work done at the Hamner Institute, under the direction of Rusty Thomas when he was here at the Hamner. By the way, he is currently the director of the ToxCast program at the National Center for Computational Toxicology. But we initiated a program that allowed us to, in a relatively high-throughput manner, generate key determinants of chemical steady-state pharmacokinetics. And that would allow us to incorporate protein binding and hepatic clearance measurements into the process. But obviously, if we don't consider the chemical pharmacokinetic behavior, we have the tendency to misrepresent potential health risks moving forward. So the strategy was undertaken to help better refine some of the predictions coming out of the ToxCast program. So before I go into my work looking at quantitating population variability, I wanted to go back to previous work that really set the stage for the work I'll be sharing with you shortly. To incorporate dosimetry with the high-throughput screening data, we primarily focused on hepatic clearance and plasma protein binding, as these will be key determinants of chemical steady-state behavior. We looked at loss of parent compound over time in a 10-donor pool of adult human hepatocytes, mixed gender, and incorporate that with the plasma protein binding data in a population-based in vitro to in vivo extrapolation tool. This was powered by SimSip, which incorporates a Monte Carlo simulation tool to allow us to simulate population variability across a wide range of individuals within our set adult group to better capture population variability, at least within this adult group. With that information, we then derived the upper 95th percentile steady-state concentration for each of the chemicals and incorporated that with the ToxCast in vitro activity values, or AC50 values, coming out of the assays. Using a process called reverse dosimetry, we could then calculate out to the oral equivalent dose, or the oral dose that would be required to achieve plasma steady-state concentrations that were equivalent to these in vitro activity concentrations. And as I alluded to before, let me go back. This information was captured over a range of different assay endpoints, hundreds. So they will be displayed across all of the assay values. This work, as I had mentioned, has been done over the past 6 years. These are 2 publications in which that earlier work has been released, and we have a 3rd paper on the way that focuses on some of the phase 2 chemicals in the ToxCast program. So all in all, over this time period, we've captured this information across over 450, primarily environmental or industrial chemicals, but some pharmaceutical compounds thrown in as well. So for those of you who work more in chemical safety rather than drug safety, you realize the value of this because typically, traditionally, this data has not been generated, and we haven't had it to work with until now. But as I mentioned earlier, this is primarily focused on data using a 10-donor pool from adults. So in essence, we're capturing the steady-state plasma concentration across the general population. But as we all well recognize, this general adult population is not necessarily going to be equal to exposure to particular life stage groups or different ethnic populations. Okay, it's well known through work. A lot of this work was collected in the early 2000s to really try to understand the range of variability in pharmacokinetics across different life stage groups. And work done quite nicely by Ginsberg captures this information across a range of different life stage groups. And you see the variability just within the different groups, whether or not you're looking at very young babies, children, juveniles, on up to teens. There's a wide range of variability. And also extending that into more of the geriatric life stage, you see differences as people age as well. A lot of this variability, we understand, comes from differences in abundances across the hepatic metabolizing enzymes. There are specific ontogenies across the different life stage groups where these primarily a lot of data is known about the hepatic CYP isozymes. You see the range of how they increase and change over time. Children are not born with levels that are equivalent of the adult abundance levels. And the rate at which they do develop occurs in more of a isozyme-specific manner. In addition, there's also the functional changes at the polymorphism level in different ethnic groups. We already understand the impact of these polymorphisms on differences in clearance and metabolism of different chemicals. So it follows that if we do not capture information across different life stage or different ethnic or even disease-based populations, we could result in having a significant underestimation of risk to a particular life stage or subpopulation group. So to better address this issue, using our previous work as a guide, but going beyond using the hepatocytes, we went with recombinantly expressed isozymes, focusing primarily on the cytochrome P450 family as well as the UGTs, which are the really have a major role in metabolizing different chemicals and xenobiotics. These were measured on an isozyme-specific level, and using the tools available within the SimCip program, we were able to bring the isozyme-specific clearance information together in a puzzle piece manner to determine the overall clearance rate, intrinsic clearance rates. And this does incorporate not just across the hepatic enzymes, but also looking at intestinal and kidney metabolism as well. With this information, within SimCip, they have information across different populations. They're pre-parameterized libraries that have captured the abundances and the differences across them. So depending on which population or life stage we're interested in, we could have a specific steady-state concentration value generated for each. This is just a sampling of what we had looked at in this particular analysis. So once we have this information at the steady state level, this looks somewhat familiar from before. We've captured this information in the population-based IVIVE, have the steady state plasma concentrations for different life stages or subpopulations. Using that information, we could use reverse dosimetry to calculate out to a life stage or subpopulation-specific oral equivalent dose. Again, we're not just looking across one activity value from the ToxCast program, but they have well over 600 different chemical assay combinations of information. So each of these box and whisker plots on the right would represent the distribution of these oral equivalents for each individual chemical across different populations. So obviously, there's a lot of data that's being captured here. Now, the units for the oral equivalent doses are in mg per kg per day. So this provides us with a direct comparator to use to compare against what we know humans to be exposed to. This particular work focused primarily on the phase 1 chemicals of ToxCast. A lot of these were food use pesticides for which pesticide re-registration eligibility documents had been prepared. And within that, they have regulatory estimates of exposures to different groups, life stage groups in adults. So we could compare and determine, if you will, a margin of exposure. And that would guide prioritization efforts. So let's say the lower whisker represents the oral equivalent dose for the most sensitive assay. If your exposure was down at the lower arrow, obviously there's a large margin of exposure, and that it's unlikely that you will be exposed at the levels where you would see activity for the most sensitive assay. Whereas if your exposure were up, more reflective of the upper arrow, obviously you're kind of in a range where you're close to that oral equivalent value. So that could guide in prioritization. You might want to focus on the chemical with a lower margin of exposure and maybe deprioritize those or at least handle at a later point, those where you have a larger margin of exposure. Moving on, this outlines briefly the experimental design. I say how we were coupling this with high-throughput screening data. And for this particular assessment, obviously, it's not high throughput at all. We looked across 18 different isozymes in the end. It's very important in this exercise to incorporate the appropriate positive as well as negative controls and look across human liver microsomes as well. We looked across 9 chemicals for this assessment. Those chemicals captured both these food use pesticides for which we had exposure estimates, but also we included a few drugs for which we had in vivo pharmacokinetic data we could gather from the literature to assess the predictivity of our IVIVE approach in this study. I outlined the time course and the concentrations ran. So in this slide, I indicate at the isozyme-specific level the loss of parent compound over time across a panel of SIPs across a subset of the compounds to give you an idea of the data we saw. I will note we are looking only at the loss of parent compound over time. We are not considering the production of metabolites. And it could be that the metabolite may be driving some of the toxicity of some of the compounds. But at least with the ToxCast data, what's important to recognize is a lot of these assays did not utilize metabolically competent cells. So in essence, that data is capturing activity of the parent compound only. So that's important to keep in mind. In terms of high throughput screening, really the cell lines that are most amenable to them are traditionally not metabolically competent. And this is a challenge that we are all working with resolving. But anyway, you see the CYP-based metabolism for azoxystrobin and fludeoxonil across the panel of enzymes. And this is looking at carbaryl and difenoconazole. And the panel of clearance that we saw varied across the chemicals. Some had quite a few. Isozymes contribute to the metabolism, as you see with difenoconazole, whereas with carbaryl, really we saw CYP1A2 as the main driver of metabolism. primarily. But looking at the isozyme-specific clearance rates in isolation is not necessarily appropriate, as these values need to be scaled up to represent what's going on overall in the organs. So to do this, within SimSip, intersystem extrapolation factors are utilized to aid in scaling the data in this manner. These ISCS are dimensionless scalars that are required to appropriately scale the in vitro data to reflect the whole organ clearance. And this pie chart at the bottom just indicates the CYP isozyme abundance across healthy adults to kind of give you a handle of the range of abundances across the different CYPs. Now, so looking at it more at that higher level value, okay, we understood the isozyme-specific clearance rates that I just showed you, but in the end of the day, when you're looking at overall clearance, what is the true fraction metabolized? And in this figure, I provide that information across the 9 chemicals that were tested. So what we saw here is pretty similar to what you would see with pharmaceutical compounds. CYP2C9 and CYP3A4 are the primary drivers of metabolism, at least of the 9 chemicals we assessed here. And from my understanding, CYP2C and CYP3A are the primary drivers in drugs. And you see with 7 of the 9 chemicals being metabolized by CYP3A4. So this captures that information across the CYPs and UGTs, the primary ones we saw involved with metabolism. Now, capturing the steady state concentration values, this is looking across carbaryl and fludeoxonil, where we saw the greatest variability. Now, along the x-axis, you see the steady state concentration values across a wide range of ethnic groups, disease-based groups, including diabetic individuals, those with renal insufficiency. And the numbers reflect the age groups or life stages that were also assessed. So from 6 to 20 years of age, 2 to 6, 6 months to 2 years, and birth to 6 months of age. Now, the upper whisker represents that upper 95th percentile. Obviously, the middle is the median, and then the lower 95th percentile. And to capture variability, at least in chemical safety arena, you would compare that upper 95th percentile of the most sensitive population against the median of the healthy individual. And this value provides you with a chemical-specific human toxicokinetic adjustment factor. Typically, in the absence of any information, an uncertainty factor of 10 is utilized to capture both toxicokinetic and pharmacodynamic variability. So if there's going to be an even split between those, a 3.2-fold value would represent that default variability that's adjusted for toxicokinetics. And obviously with carbaryl, when you compare it against the newborn population, the adjustment factor well exceeds that at 11.4-fold. For fludeoxonil, the value is very similar. Now, if you look across some of the other populations, obviously the variability is not going to be as great, but typically what did emerge with this assessment was that in most cases that newborn group was indeed the most sensitive. Looking again at acetochlor and difenoconazole, these were more rapidly cleared, and you see that the variability is decreased compared to carbaryl and fludeoxonil. The adjustment factors for these were 6.7 and 3.5 when compared to that newborn group. Now, providing you with more of a 30,000-foot view across all of the 9 chemicals that we assessed, you see the range of variability here. And as I mentioned, carbaryl and fludeoxonil, we saw the greatest variability. And in looking at the data more closely compared to, say, haloperidol, what emerged was those chemicals where we had maybe 1 or 2 metabolizing enzymes that were the primary drivers of the metabolism, that's where we saw the greatest variability. But for the others, such as haloperidol or tebupremifos, which is located in the lower right corner, several of the isozymes did contribute to the clearance of the compounds, so that you almost have redundancy within the system. And where one CYP might be at a low level in a particular age group, maybe another one is compensating with the clearance. So we saw that pattern emerge. Moving forward, we were very curious to see how well our IVIVE approach with the recombinant CYP data would compare to the in vivo pharmacokinetics. And to do that, we did have to incorporate some drugs in this assessment that were also screened in the ToxCast program, haloperidol and lovastatin. There was in vivo pharmacokinetic data available for carbaryl. And I'll note again, for those in pharma, you can imagine with some of these pesticides and chemicals, we did not have a lot of in vivo pharmacokinetic information on pesticides to really refine our particular prediction tools. So we rely heavily on the pharma data. And frankly, we're happy if we get within tenfold. And we kind of justify that because from our perspective, it's more about protecting human health, and you want to make sure you're being conservative and protective. So in our particular strategies, typically where we fail in agreement, we overpredict. So it's incorporating a conservative adjustment. Looking at this data with carbaryl, we did get reasonably close to the in vivo PK value of 0.03 micromolar, as you can see here. There were multiple in vivo studies available for haloperidol and lovastatin. Depending on which study you're looking at, we got within four-fold, 4 to 6-fold, 4 to 5-fold. So we were reasonably happy with this result for these particular chemicals. Moving on, this is providing the chemical-specific toxico adjustment factors across the chemicals assessed here, represented in this column, the second and from the left. You see the range, as I talked about earlier, from about 3.5 on up to 11.5-fold. The most sensitive population typically was the newborn group from 0 to 6 months of age. With the difenoconazole and tebuprimifos, those that had the lower variability because more isozymes were kicking into the metabolism, the clearance of the compounds. The group with renal insufficiency was actually the most sensitive. And this just provides you with the data across the 95th percentile and the median CSS values. Moving on, in this, the data was translated into oral equivalent doses. So this is looking at the life stage or subpopulation specific oral equivalent doses captured by these box and whisker plots. Note that these are on a log scale on the left side. And for azoxystrobin and fludeoxonil here, the symbols below the box and whiskers represent the exposure estimates for the different life stage groups captured here, where those regulatory estimates were provided in mg per kg per day. So you see with azoxystrobin, say the margin of exposure across the 4 groups where we do have these regulatory estimates was somewhere between 10 and 100. So that provides you with that margin of exposure estimate. For fludeoxonil, we did see some overlap here. So the MOE was at 1 or a little bit less than 1. So in a prioritization strategy, obviously we're going to want to look more closely at fludeoxonil, the in vitro activities that were observed to assess whether or not, to follow up this with more in-depth assessments to better understand potential human health hazard. Moving on to the next set of chemicals, in this panel we show acetochlor and difenoconazole. For acetochlor, the margins of exposure are more on the order of 100 to 1,000. Difenoconazole, they're again within 10 to 100. So obviously within a prioritization strategy, as I alluded to, this is not a particularly high throughput approach. But we do understand by looking at the, let me talk about this. This is looking across the 6 chemicals for which we have these margin of exposures. You could see where we might want to prioritize chemicals once we have the information from the adult hepatocytes. Maybe those in that particular application where we have a margin of exposure of, say, less than 100, we might want to delve in more closely and better understand the population variability across the different potential sensitive populations. That's how this particular tool might be utilized within a toxicity testing or tiered testing approach. For tebupremifos down here in the lower right, the exposure estimates were actually well below the value listed here, so the margin of exposure would be quite large. So in conclusion, at least in the chemical safety arena, this was the first comprehensive attempt to combine physiologic and pharmaco differences to quantitate variability anticipated between different life stage, ethnic, and disease-based populations. And largely what we observed was that the extent of this variability was determined primarily by how many isozymes might step in and contribute to the clearance of a particular compound. So while these adjustment factors routinely exceeded the default 3.2-fold uncertainty factors assigned for toxicokinetic-based variability for the most sensitive population, the adjustment factors for most of these chemicals were typically within 10-fold. And really, since we've identified that newborn population as one to focus on, that could require the lion's share of our attention. Now, in assessments of variability, in addition to pharmacokinetic variability, there's also going to be pharmacodynamic-based differences, which is beyond the scope of this work, but it's important to note that this is always also going to contribute to the variability across different life stages and how an individual responds to a particular chemical exposure. Okay, so this work was done in close collaboration with Lisa Allman of SimSip. The primary team at the Hamner that conducted the LCMS analysis was Brittany Allen. Timothy Parker ran the incubations as well. They were really key individuals involved in the running of these samples and generating the data. I also want to acknowledge Masoud Jameh. I've certainly enjoyed some wonderful, rewarding conversations with him over the several years that I've known him now, and also collaborations with Rusty Thomas and John Wambaugh within the National Center for Computational Toxicology.